Early 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The front in Western Europe is still moving, but its movement is no longer immediate. Advances are planned, submitted, reviewed. Messages travel forward faster than fuel and return slower than expectations. Decisions now arrive layered, measured, and timed. What once moved on momentum increasingly waits on approval. Within this environment, delay becomes a tool, not a denial, not a reversal, but a pause inserted into a system already under strain. A proposal from Third Army reaches higher command with urgency attached to it. Conditions on the ground appear favorable. Opportunity seems perishable. Speed, in this moment, feels decisive. At theater level, the same proposal looks different. Eisenhower does not reject it. He does not issue a counter-order. He allows time to intervene. Review replaces response. Coordination precedes authorization. The absence of immediate approval begins to shape the battlefield before any movement occurs. For Patton, the delay is unmistakable. It does not cancel action, but it changes its character. Momentum now depends on timing he does not control. Initiative must wait to be absorbed by a larger design. What is said in response is not defiance and not acquiescence. It is recognition. Acknowledgement that the war has entered a phase where decisions are not only about what to do, but when to allow it to happen. From this pause, consequences begin to form. By the opening months of 1945, the Western Front had entered a stage defined by management rather than breakthrough. The Allied armies had achieved what once seemed unlikely, a sustained advance from the Normandy beaches to the German frontier. Paris had been liberated, Belgium secured, and the German army forced back behind successive defensive lines. Yet this success carried a cost. The further the front moved east, the more fragile the system sustaining it became. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force existed to manage that fragility. Eisenhower's responsibility extended beyond any single army's momentum. British, American, Canadian, and Free French formations advanced under a shared command framework, dependent on the same ports, rail lines, fuel depots, and air support. Every rapid movement forward created pressure elsewhere. Coordination was not an administrative preference. It was the condition that prevented collapse under success. Patton's Third Army had played a central role in reaching this point. Its operational style emphasized speed, initiative, and continuous pressure. During the advance across France in the summer of 1944, this approach exploited German disorganization and allowed Allied forces to regain the initiative at a pace few had anticipated. Even during the winter crisis created by the German Ardennes counteroffensive, Third Army demonstrated flexibility by pivoting north to relieve threatened sectors, reinforcing Patton's conviction that decisive movement depended on acting before opportunity closed. By early 1945, however, conditions had shifted. German forces, though weakened, were no longer in open retreat. They withdrew toward prepared positions, trading space for time. Supply constraints became unavoidable. Fuel shortages limited armored movement. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Engineer units were stretched thin repairing bridges and roads damaged by retreating German forces. Winter weather slowed transport and increased wear on vehicles already pushed beyond planned limits. These constraints elevated the importance of approval and timing. Operations that might earlier have proceeded on commander's intent now required alignment across the theater. Eisenhower increasingly relied on review and sequencing to ensure that advances occurred where they could be sustained and supported by adjacent formations. Delayed approval became a method of control, allowing higher command to shape tempo without issuing explicit prohibitions. Patton experienced this shift directly. Proposals that emphasized speed now entered a longer process. Authorization depended not only on local conditions, but on resource availability, coalition priorities, and political considerations extending beyond the battlefield. Delay did not signal distrust. It reflected a system adjusting to the realities of late-war coalition fighting. German command monitored these patterns closely. Pauses in Allied movement were studied for opportunity, but increasingly failed to produce decisive advantage. As coordination improved, German planners focused less on counterattack and more on delaying actions designed to preserve manpower for defenses closer to the Rhine. The success of these tactics depended on Allied misalignment, which delayed approval sought to prevent. This moment mattered because it marked a transition in how power was exercised. Speed remained valuable, but only when synchronized. Initiative still mattered, but only when absorbed by the system supporting it. Eisenhower's refusal to grant immediate approval was not an isolated decision. It was part of a broader shift toward deliberate control, where timing itself became a form of authority. For Patton, this required adjustment. The battlefield still offered opportunity, but the path to exploiting it now ran through coordination rather than momentum alone. The delay that followed his proposals did not stop the war's progress. It reshaped how progress would occur. What followed would demonstrate how time, once inserted into the decision process, could become as decisive as movement itself. From Patton's perspective, timing was inseparable from success. His experience had taught him that opportunity degraded rapidly once exposed. German units, even when weakened, retained the ability to reorganize if given hours or days instead of minutes. For Patton, delayed approval risked converting advantage into routine advance. Speed was not impatience. It was a method for denying the enemy recovery. Eisenhower approached the same proposals through a different responsibility. As Supreme Allied Commander, he did not measure effectiveness solely by local outcome. He evaluated whether action could be sustained without distorting the entire front. Delayed approval allowed him to test assumptions, verify resource availability, and ensure alignment across national forces. To Eisenhower, time spent reviewing was not time lost. It was time invested in preventing imbalance. Subordinate commanders within Third Army experienced delay in practical terms. Corps and division leaders prepared plans that waited on authorization. Units staged equipment and personnel while fuel and ammunition allocations were confirmed. This waiting created frustration, but it also reduced uncertainty. When approval arrived, movements occurred with clearer support and coordination. Delay altered rhythm, but it also imposed predictability. The human dimension intensified these effects. Soldiers close to the front sensed momentum and anticipated movement. Pauses introduced doubt alongside fatigue, yet prolonged overextension carried its own cost. Eisenhower understood that morale sustained by constant motion could fracture if supply failed abruptly. Controlled pacing offered a different form of stability, one less visible but more durable. German command interpreted Allied delays cautiously. Early in the campaign, pauses had sometimes created openings for counterattack. By early 1945, that pattern weakened. Delayed approval increasingly produced coordinated movement rather than hesitation. German planners adjusted by emphasizing delay and withdrawal rather than exploitation. The absence of immediate Allied response no longer implied vulnerability. Political considerations also shaped perception. Allied leaders were attentive to how operations appeared to partners and to populations soon to be occupied. Sudden unilateral advances risked political complications that extended beyond military calculation. Eisenhower's insistence on review and coordination reassured coalition partners that operations remained aligned with shared objectives. Each perspective reflected rational adaptation to changing conditions. Patton viewed delay as a threat to initiative. Eisenhower viewed it as a safeguard against fragmentation. Subordinates balanced readiness with restraint. Allies monitored cohesion. German forces recalibrated expectations. What mattered was not which perspective prevailed, but how they converged. Delayed approval became a mechanism that integrated urgency into structure. It absorbed Patton's demand for speed without allowing it to outrun coordination. As these perspectives intersected, the consequences of delay moved from abstraction to reality. Plans waited. Conditions shifted. Decisions made earlier narrowed options later. The stage was set for a moment when timing itself would determine what could still be done. The point at which delayed approval became decisive did not arrive through a formal rejection or a revised order. It arrived through accumulation. As proposals waited for authorization, the conditions that had made them urgent began to change. Weather shifted, enemy units repositioned, resources were reassigned. Time, once inserted into the process, started to shape outcomes independently. Eisenhower did not need to issue a denial to assert control. The approval chain itself performed that function. Plans moved upward for review, where they were evaluated against theater-wide priorities rather than local advantage. Fuel allocations were examined in relation to parallel operations. Air support was scheduled according to broader sequencing. Engineer assets were committed where they enabled sustained advance, not immediate exploitation. Each of these steps narrowed the range of feasible action. For Third Army, this process altered the character of decision-making. Movements that depended on surprise or rapid follow-through lost viability as hours passed. Opportunities that had appeared clear at the time of proposal became less distinct. When authorization eventually arrived, it often did so with conditions attached, modified objectives, adjusted timelines, or reallocated resources. Speed was permitted, but only within a framework already reshaped by delay. This was the moment when alternatives disappeared. It was no longer a question of whether approval would be granted quickly or slowly. The system had demonstrated that timing itself was a form of authority. By withholding immediate approval, Eisenhower ensured that only actions compatible with coordination would survive the review process. Others dissolved under the weight of changing conditions. German command observed these patterns closely. Delays in Allied movement no longer produced exploitable gaps. Instead, they preceded deliberate, supported advances. German planners adjusted by prioritizing withdrawal and demolition over counterattack. Bridges were prepared for destruction. Rearguard units were assigned to delay rather than hold. The absence of immediate Allied action ceased to signal opportunity. At the coalition level, delayed approval reinforced confidence. British, American, and French commanders saw operations unfolding within predictable rhythms. No single army appeared to be racing ahead of agreed priorities. Political leaders interpreted this steadiness as evidence of control at a moment when the approach to Germany itself carried symbolic weight. For Patton, the turning point was not emotional, it was practical. He recognized that pressing for immediate approval no longer produced the desired effect. The battlefield still offered opportunity, but the path to exploiting it had narrowed. Speed without authorization became irrelevant. What mattered was whether an action could endure review long enough to remain viable. The words Patton used in response reflected this understanding. They did not challenge authority. They acknowledged constraint. Delay had become an operational reality, not an exception. The war had entered a phase where initiative was filtered through timing, and timing was controlled from above. From this point forward, the campaign unfolded within that reality. Decisions were shaped by the time required to approve them. Plans were crafted with anticipation of review rather than expectation of immediate execution. What had begun as a pause became a permanent feature of command. The turning point, therefore, was not a refusal, it was recognition. Once delay proved decisive, the structure governing approval no longer needed to assert itself. It simply continued, shaping outcomes through time rather than command. Once delayed approval became an accepted feature of command. Its consequences spread across the Western Front in measured ways. Operations did not cease, but they changed character. Advances were planned with anticipation of review rather than expectation of immediate execution. Tempo adjusted to fit the time required for coordination, resource confirmation, and alignment with adjacent forces. For Third Army, this meant adapting to a different rhythm of war. Patton's formations continued to press forward, but opportunities defined by speed alone became less relevant. Gains were pursued where they could be supported, reinforced, and absorbed by the broader system. When approval arrived, movements were deliberate, supplied, and synchronized. The cost was flexibility. The benefit was endurance. At the theater level, Eisenhower's use of delay stabilized operations. Fuel shortages were managed more predictably. Air support reinforced planned advances rather than reacting to sudden demands. Engineer assets were concentrated on infrastructure that enabled sustained movement across the front. Roads, bridges, and rail connections critical to the final push into Germany. The Allied advance became less volatile and more continuous. Coalition cohesion strengthened as a result. British, American, and French commanders operated within shared expectations. Political leaders observed a campaign conducted with restraint and coordination as Allied forces approached Germany itself. The risk of unilateral action shaping post-war realities diminished. Delay, once perceived as hesitation, became reassurance. German forces experienced these consequences through compression rather than shock. Allied pauses no longer produced exploitable gaps. Instead, they preceded coordinated pressure that denied space and time simultaneously. Defensive plans focused increasingly on withdrawal and demolition rather than counterattack. Rearguard units absorbed growing losses as avenues of retreat narrowed. German capacity to influence the tempo of events eroded steadily. Strategically, delayed approval shaped the final approach to decisive operations. Major movements benefited from concentrated resources and unified planning. When breakthroughs occurred, they were supported rather than improvised. The absence of immediate authorization earlier in the process ensured that later action unfolded with greater certainty. The consequences of Eisenhower's refusal to grant immediate approval were therefore cumulative. They did not eliminate initiative. They disciplined it. They did not slow the war. They regulated it. By narrowing options through time, the command system ensured that progress, once made, could be sustained until resistance collapsed. What followed was not acceleration, but convergence, toward an end shaped as much by timing as by movement. This episode endures because it reveals how authority is exercised when victory is close, but uncertainty remains. In the final months of the war, Command was no longer defined by the freedom to act, but by the responsibility to decide when action could safely occur. Patton's reaction to delayed approval reflected a commander shaped by momentum. His instinct was to move before opportunity faded. Eisenhower's refusal to act immediately reflected a different obligation. He was responsible for ensuring that movement could be sustained across an entire front, within a coalition whose unity mattered as much as speed. Neither approach was flawed. Each operated at a different scale. What made Eisenhower's leadership decisive was his use of time as a controlling variable. By allowing review, coordination, and sequencing to intervene, he narrowed the range of viable options without issuing prohibitions. Authority functioned quietly, through procedure rather than confrontation. The absence of immediate approval shaped outcomes as decisively as any order. For Patton, adaptation replaced insistence. His effectiveness did not disappear under delayed authorization. It was redirected. Speed remained valuable, but only when it survived review. The battlefield no longer rewarded impulse alone. It rewarded actions that could endure the time required to support them. Historically, this moment matters because it demonstrates how decisions remove alternatives. Once delayed approval became standard practice, returning to earlier autonomy was neither possible nor necessary. The war's final phase unfolded through managed pressure rather than sudden acceleration. The conclusion of the Western European campaign was not shaped by a single refusal or a single voice. It was shaped by a system that understood when to wait. In that sense, what Patton said mattered less than what the structure allowed. Timing, once embedded in command, carried the war to its inevitable end.